Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Qredible broadcast. Today is actually a webinar where we are covering regulation in motion, breaking down Section 781 and its industry impact. Today, of course, we have Brian Fitzpatrick, CEO of Qredible. Hi, Brian. How are you?
Good to be back.
Yeah. And we have special guests, Tom Lineen and Doug Fischer.
All right, and Tom's on the road and agreed to join us for this. So welcome back, Tom and Doug. You've both been on our show before, and it's an important topic. So we're glad to have you both here. So for those of you following along at home, today we're talking about Section 781. So it's a provision that was quietly buried inside a government spending bill and signed into law in November of 2025. So it's set to redefine what hemp legally is in this country starting on November 12th of this year. So that's 188 days or so from now. So as I indicated, Tom's here with us, Tom Lineen, founder and president of WestTown Payments. And he's been on the front lines of what I would call highly regulated merchant processing in this space for years. And he's one of the pioneers and leaders in this space. So, Tom, great to have you back. Welcome. And also Doug Fischer, General Counsel at Active and President of VapeSAFER. So Doug brings the legal and industry lens that we need today. So welcome back to Doug as well. So great to have you both back on the show.
Thank you.
So Tom, before we dive into the regulation itself, just quickly set the table a little bit for our audience. And what does the hemp and CBD payments landscape look like today, and how has it been for processors that have been trying to really do their best to serve this space?
Absolutely, thank you. Well, you know, I'd say the landscape, except for the topic we're discussing today, has been fairly positive. There has been a lot of evolution on what is and is not covered in the Farm Act, 2018 Farm Act, which is super important. So if the Farm Act was moot on that point, then the market did what the market did, and then the banks had to make decisions on that. And then also what either legal precedent had been set since, where maybe a judge had weighed in on a certain product or a certain product being or not being compliant under the 2018 Farm Act. And so we have been able to evolve our underwriting, our risk strategy for merchant services, even for the banking perspective, on what is a compliant business for us to bank and what is not. And so we felt like we were on a good path. We had we were doing, and we are doing quite well, but this little wrinkle has come in, and obviously that's why we're here today, is to talk about what the world could look like post November 12th. And so I think to sum it up, we felt very confident, and now we kind of got kneecapped a little bit, and we're dusting off and looking and saying, okay, what are we looking at?
Well, there's a lot to talk about what we're looking at and where we're going. And Doug, but I want to hear from your perspective, is from the legal side. When you describe the hemp compliance environment in 2025, I mean, some folks have referred to it as the wild, wild west. What comes to mind for you?
Uncertainty, transition, murky. I don't know what the right word is, but it's everywhere, right? I think we got the law. It took us, a minute to digest it. And we, to an extent, understand what it means, but we're still waiting on FDA rulemaking on several components of the rule, like definition of a container. I know we'll get into that. We're still waiting for potentially more clarity on, what falls is under the label synthetic. And so you still have uncertainties, even though this law, is scheduled to come into effect in 6 months, give or take. And then also uncertainty because what legislation might happen between now and then. And then throw one more thing on top of it, which is the enforcement picture, right? Is there a world where highly regulated hemp markets like Minnesota, for example, right, get treated by the federal government, much like regulated cannabis has been treated, where if you're tested and regulated, it's okay. And so, I know it's an unsatisfying word, but that's all I can say, because it's this law is a full-on lawyer employment act.
Yeah, well, it's good words to describe the situation. And as everybody knows, Section 781 was really buried inside HR 5371. Now, the Continuing Appropriations Act, okay, this is what happened. So when that was being sort of voted on, if you remember, we had a 42-day government shutdown, right? So it was not a standalone hemp bill, as some people believe, and it passed because it was attached to that legislation in order to get the government sort of remain open. And I looked at that and said, there's no way that that's going to get overturned, because they're not going to sit there with 42 days with the government being closed to debate hemp, right? So it got snuck in, and it amended 297A of the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946, which was the same statute that was used essentially to pass the 2018 Farm Bill to actually legalize hemp. So the key change here is the legal definition of hemp is shifting from Delta 9 THC, 0.3% or less, to total THC, okay? And that's a completely different measurement, because total THC is calculated as THCA times 0.877 plus Delta 9 plus Delta 8 plus Delta 10, and any cannabinoids that the HHS determines have similar effects, which there's a lot of these THC type synthetics. So they also put a hard cap of 0.4 milligrams of total THC per container, and it ends an entire class of synthetic cannabinoids, right? So when you look at what U.S. Hemp Roundtable has been saying, they've been saying about 95% of existing hemp-derived cannabinoid products will be eliminated, 95%, right, if no legislation changes occur. So some of those products, some people are not unhappy to see go away, and that makes sense because they were never intended to be under the Farm Act. But others were throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So what I'd like to do is throw up some slides real quick. So Faith, if you could throw, okay, there you go. So U.S. Hemp Roundtable said 95%. So what I'd like you to understand is what we did is we've processed hundreds of thousands of COAs through our compliance engines, all right? And we do this for banks, merchant processors to be able to review these products quickly for underwriting and ongoing compliance. So what I did is I took a good subset of products, about 10,000 different COAs, 10,000 different products of different variations, and I ran them through our compliance engine and overlaid 781. 98.5% is the number. Okay, so not too far off of what U.S. Hemp Roundtable's saying. So if you look at what this really is, so that's 10,000 products with valid COA data, currently compliant, 9,932 of them. All right. Under 781, that number goes to 9,883 violative. So it almost completely turns the other way around, with only 146 that are confirmed compliant if we hit that compliance cliff and nothing changes. So what was currently green is going to go primarily all red. So only 146 surviving products. So, what products were specifically impacted here? Well, Delta 8 out the window. I mean, every single one of those that are in the thing are gone. HHC, no more. Under this act, you won't be seeing any of that. Delta 10, THC 10, whatever you want to call it, THC 0 acetate, these products are immediately effective. So, what is basically those product categories where we're going to see major impacts? So really, the majority of these numbers are because of the weight threshold and quote unquote, we're going to get into the discussion, as Doug said, about container, right? But as we look at it, most of these things under the basic, we had to make a basic assumption about a container size, are going to be essentially eliminated. THCA products, and for those of you wondering about THCA, it's basically when you heat up THC or Delta 9, goes through the decarboxylation process, turns into that THC. But you'll see a lot of products are now leading with that in their name. So without even looking at the COA, THCA out the window as well. Edibles, we're going to have an interesting discussion about this container and how folks are going to be working around a 0.4 milligram. But what those products are that survived are pretty much the ones that were, when you look at the category of these products, you can see, I was surprised, by the way, that pet products, I thought that, most of those would survive, but, and the majority of them will not. I mean, that tells you how strict some of these THC standards are. And then when we get into other products, the reason why some of the topicals, the soft gels, are a little bit less than closer to 100% is because there's broad spectrum products in there, which meaning advertising no THC content whatsoever. So the broad spectrum products will survive, but unfortunately, it's going to impact the full spectrum products, which we'll talk about also in a little bit. So only 146 products out of the 10,000, basically 1.5% are confirmed as compliant post 781, given this analysis. So what do you guys think about that? I mean, you can pull that slide down now, Faith. What's your thought on those numbers?
Brian, you always bring the good news, huh?
Sorry, I'm just reporting fact.
You're just the messenger. I get it. You're just the messenger.
Just the messenger.
I mean, in a way, and I don't say this in a way that makes me happy, but it proves the point of the politicians who forced this law upon us in the first place, who snuck it into the Farm Bill, right? The whole idea, they said that this was never intended to unleash a torrent of intoxicating products. And you can argue whether it was intended for that or not. It is what it is. But I mean, it's clear that was the impact of it, right? And I think, those of us in the industry understood that there's been what I'd call some, less than totally candid advocacy sort of saying, oh no, it's this, but you see it, 98.5% of the products are, most likely meant to get you intoxicated. Maybe there's a few percent that just happen to just be just over, and like the pet products. That was shocking to me, actually. I thought they would be okay, but that's, I mean, it's an entire shift in the market. And then my next thought goes to, well, how is this going to be enforced? Because things just don't go away the second they're legal. So then what happens?
Yeah, absolutely. And, and literally when you look at sort of what this container thing is, so you're absolutely right. The FDA has sort of, they've missed on defining what container is. I mean, we have a loose definition of the container is the innermost package, right, of the product. All right. So does that mean I can buy a giant bag of gummies with each one individually packaged inside? And then each one of those would be sort of 0.4%, milligrams in that one little package, because FDA still hasn't given us specific guidance. So we've got this gummy bag scenario where they could, we'll see individually wrapped gummies in an outer bag, like I said. You've got the 4-pack beverage question. You've got lots of questions that this brings up. And somebody said to me, if the FDA is not ready to enforce this, then how is it going to be enforced at all? People will just keep doing that. And I said, no, the banking and payments industry is going to enforce it, because they're going to have to. So if you can't sell your products and get a credit card, through a credit card online, then effectively it's being enforced. So what do you guys, what are your thoughts about this whole issue and the critical point for processors and banks and even merchants?
I'll say your illustration is actually very powerful, because it says what is now compliant literally become overnight compliant. And so, but you're right. The way that they're going to enforce this is through the banks, through us, and through the card brands, and and that's certainly, and this is not unusual. There's a lot of precedent set in previous initiatives where they go, oh, the processors, the banks, we'll lean on them and they'll deal with it. So you're right, Brian. It's the electronic payments go away, especially in the D2C market. I guess, that it could technically have a bank-to-bank payment mechanism, but that there's a lot of effort that goes into that. The user experience gets diminished, and it gets complicated. And so that definitely will be affected. I think the other thing is, just going back to even the container thing is a whole nother. I liken it to somebody who has a heart attack also has cancer. What do you treat first?
Right.
And that's, I think that's not unintentional, frankly, how they did that. But the real zinger is the math, right? The total THC versus how we had previously measured with Delta 9 less than 0.3%. So that is where this becomes very challenging, and certainly put some additional emphasis and weight on folks like us, and I say WestTown Payments, Dart Bank, because we have to, basically we're being, we'll eventually be called on to enforce this. I will say this too. It does seem like the way this rule is written today, and this is also one of the challenges we have, is do we do something about it today to get ahead of November 12th, or do we sit still and wait because you expect something to happen? And there's a tremendous amount of activity, I'm sure you'll talk about that later, of bills being introduced and other things that would either extend the deadline to figure out some of these questions, or will effectively replace this language with something that's a little bit more fair for the industry. What does that look like? How do they break it down? There's a lot of questions right now. I mean, I know we're in May. I think you're, I read something, 188 days away. So
it's a countdown.
That feels like a long time. It's a half year, but it moves quickly. And as we stand today, it's really difficult to make a policy on something that, yes, it's close, but it's also just as far, knowing how much movement's occurring, or maybe attempted movement, we'll use as a term, is occurring as we speak. So I don't want to necessarily say that to say like, oh, don't worry, but I also don't want to say the sky's falling either, because we just don't know.
Right. Well, the one thing I do know is, like, today, obviously, your company always embraced technology to help get through underwriting and managing of risk. And, when I look at what we do as a company, we're automatically analyzing COAs on these websites. We pull them down, we analyze them. But if you think about it, what we're doing is we're analyzing pretty much one number. I mean, we pull all the data, but we're analyzing one number. It's that 0.3% of Delta 9. And we look at the dates. Is the date valid, and does it match the product? And is it from a bona fide lab and all that fun stuff? But that analysis now, which takes a lot of time if anybody does it manually, that's going to be 2 to 3 to 4 times more. Because now you're sitting there with the calculator. Now you're looking at, okay, do we have container size? So we have to understand the container size. We have to do the math against container based on what's in that product. And it's going to take, obviously our technology is tooled and ready for it to go. And that's why one of the things that I think what you're talking about is you really got to take a proactive approach. I mean, you guys and at WestTown have always been very good at supporting your customers through these regulatory hurdles and working with them while staying compliant. And I think that's sort of a key message is for, the banks not to abandon the customers, but understand ahead of time, what is the impact going to be? How do we prepare for this? And what is it going to look like? So are the merchants going to start to pivot? What I can tell you is that we already saw, in fact, a press release was put out by Nowadays, and they're not waiting for enforcement. They're not lobbying for a delay. I mean, I'm sure they are, but they're doing both at the same time. So they're getting ahead of this, and in doing so, they just had a press release go out. So Nowadays is a hemp beverage company, and their products will be federally legal. They're putting a new formulated product out, with the kind of that container law. So they're retooling operations, they're getting ready, and they have now started to produce those things. So this is what I call Fitz logic, and you guys tell me whether I'm whacked or not when it comes to this. This is what I've told some of the hemp beverage folks, and I'm going to revert it back to a story. So I looked in my refrigerator, and there was a half a can of hemp beverage in there, and I said, who's drinking the hemp beverage, right? And my daughter, who's in her 20s, said, that was me, Dad. And I said, well, you left a half a can in there. She goes, Dad, I can't drink that whole can. Like, I'll be buzzed. So I only drank half of it because I don't want to be like, overly buzzed. I still got to go out and everything. So I started thinking about that. And I'm like, you know what? This might be good for the hemp beverage business, because if you want to get buzzed, you got to buy 2 to 3 to 4 times more. And it's become more of a social issue for this California sober, right? So people are replacing alcohol, with these hemp beverages, but instead of, leaving half a can, you can have a full can or 2 cans, and it could be your drink of choice for the night without getting absolutely whacked. So Fitz logic is, I think this is good, as far as hemp beverage. Now, people might say I'm whacked on that, but think about it. You got to drink 3 to 4 times as much to get the impact. So it actually will increase sales. So I don't know what you guys think about that logic and about this whole packaging, and then we'll talk about. I'll ask you guys about some of these bills that are coming up. We'll set that up as well. But what's your just general thinking about that?
Yeah, well, I think you're onto something. But I think the limit is so low that I don't know if that logic fully carries out, right? Because 0.4 milligrams per can. So now to get 4 milligrams, which is, even for a relatively novice consumer, not a terribly high dose, right? And everyone ingests it differently, and people probably, but so now you need 10 cans. It's, and it's the same thing with the gummy, right? To get the equivalent of 1 10 milligram gummy, you're going to have to eat 25 gummies. Like, I would be sick. And so I think there's something to the low dose piece of it, but is the dose too low to be commercially viable, right? I just don't picture people choosing to eat 25 gummies. And some people eat 2 or 3 10 milligram gummies, by the way, right? So I think it's a tough sell, and it's interesting because I saw the press release from Nowadays, and I thought that was interesting. The press release that caught my attention the other day was Target, who said they're putting, in 300 stores in Illinois, Texas, and Florida are going to roll out more hemp beverage. And they weren't terribly specific on what that means, but I said, like, wow. My first reaction is somebody knows something. I don't know who and what, but like, is that an announcement you would be making if you didn't have confidence that something was going to change? I don't know. It is a very, really made me scratch my head.
That's a good observation, Doug. I love it. Okay, so maybe Fitz logic's off a little bit because you have to drink a whole case, but so it is kind of low. Okay, I admit that, and look, I even look at the little full spectrum CBD tincture that I take. Right, I was looking at that bottle. I was looking at the COA with it, and I'm like, holy cow! Like, this is violative. I looked at the THC cream I use on my joints, and I'm like, wow, that's violative. Like, so I got 2 products in my house that I use that are going to be illegal post this. And by the way, I could drink that whole bottle of tincture, and there's no way I'm getting high off it. But we're completely losing the entourage effect, right, of a full spectrum CBD. So we've got Mehmet Oz out there that's saying, oh, this is what full spectrum is going to look like. But Mehmet, you got to realize you're not going to have a full spectrum product. Like, it's, so Trump's talking, I got the groups working on this, and we're going to do all these things, but you're not going to have a full entourage effect. You're not going to have a good full spectrum CBD that gives you these medicinal benefits, because 781 kills it. So let's talk about what the government's doing about it. So, there's 4 or 5 different bills. There's HR 6209, American Hemp Protection Act. There's HR 7024. Doug, which one of these do you think actually have a chance in hell of actually something happening?
It's hard for me to see any of them happening, as much as I think a delay would be the sensible thing to do here, right? Just give some breathing room, make some rules. I think ultimately, personally, my view is we should be heading towards a regulation of cannabinoids, not the source of those cannabinoids, right? There should be one unified regulatory regime under federal law. But the realist, so that's the optimist in me. That's where I want to go. The realist in me says that's not happening anytime soon.
Well, you're making too much sense for the government.
Yeah, right. Well said. And now we're in an election year. So what, after the summer? No, I mean, every representative is about to start their campaigns to run for office. So we got a war going on. We've got it's not a time where I think this issue is going to get a lot of airtime. It's just that's just the reality of it. So while I think there's a lot of logic behind several of these proposals, and I particularly like the old Wyden bill, the CSRA, I think that's a very thoughtful piece of legislation. I just don't know if there's enough motivation for anyone to work on it with everything else that's happening.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem. So for folks at home, CSRA is the Cannabinoid Safety and Regulation Act. So introduced by Senator Ron Wyden, who I've been following very carefully on this over the years. He's really been an advocate for the industry, and Senator Jeff Merkley. So both from Oregon here, and they've introduced that in December, I believe it was. So it's an 84-page replacement framework, which I think is what's needed. So it's 5 milligram THC serving, 50 milligram per container for edibles, 10 milligram for beverages, keeping a 21 age minimum and a mandatory third-party testing. So that has not passed, right? But it had a lot of promise, and I've spoken to Wyden's team a couple of times, and they've been working really hard on that, and it seems to be not moving in the direction that we all hoped it would. There is the Farm Food and National Security Act of 2026, which is essentially, when we look at anything farm bill sort of related, they seem to be focusing sort of farm bill more on the agricultural hemp side. And to your point, Doug, we really ought to be focusing on the cannabinoids itself. So some of these are like the American Hemp Protection Act, which is 6209, Nancy Mace, South Carolina, and co-sponsors Tom Massey. And Massey, of course, is Kentucky, from the same home state of the person who created this terrible bill. And we won't talk about the lobbying from the liquor industry and all that, and the money that went to the PAC on that. But what we will talk about is that particular bill would repeal 781 entirely, restoring the Farm Bill. So we don't think that has a chance either. So the best we can hope for is a delay. But what do you think about because these bills, in order to sort of change legislation, they need something to attach to, right? They need momentum, because and to your point, Doug, it's not going to happen on a standalone basis. Do you think this could ride in the September sort of spending build like it did in November, like where caused the shutdown? So the last September one, do you think it might be something that could sneak into September?
It could. It could, and I don't want to be negative, because I'm hopeful that it would. But I mean, you said it yourself. We had so much trouble passing a funding of Homeland Security, right? Something that's typically not that controversial, right? And ultimately, what had to happen was a super stripped down bill that didn't even accomplish the full funding, to my understanding. And I'm not an expert in that area, so what's going to be the appetite for people to use their political capital on a hemp bill, as logical as it is in this environment? I'm not sure whether it's there right now. And I'd say one of the things as an industry we haven't done a great job of, we've done a good job of cultivating sponsors on the Hill. There are plenty of politicians who are friendly to the industry and support it. What we haven't done a good job of, and I hope this doesn't sound too Machiavellian, but is making those same sponsors and others understand that there will be consequences if they don't advocate. So they can go to the things and raise money, but then they still drop the hemp or cannabis issue as the first bargaining chip because no one's raised enough money to fund their opponents, right? And that's unfortunately the way Washington works. And I don't think any of them feel that kind of pressure from the hemp or the cannabis industry.
Yeah, that's interesting. And some further tension is that I want to highlight is, as I said earlier, President Trump has sent signals of support for the CBD industry. And he said, so many people rely on it. And it's true, they do. I mean, they're giving away CBD, I know in Israel, by the way, for years in nursing homes, right? And I know a lot of older people, and I guess I'll put myself in that category, even though I'm not that old, that use that product, right? I mean, I use it for inflammation. I use it, I'm not supposed to make medical claims, but it's a natural supplement that works, right? On me, it really is very helpful. And that entourage effect is important. Yet, and Trump has said, that he's supporting this, but yet 781 was signed on his watch as part of a funding bill that needed to pass. The administration has not publicly moved to delay or repeal it. All these things have fallen flat. And FDA keeps missing, critical deadlines, a February 10th deadline to publish the required guidance list. Now, I have heard that they have a draft out, but it's not publicly available. Yet the enforcement clock is running. So Trump's general deregulatory posture has been business friendly towards the hemp industry, but yet 781 was enacted law. Let's not forget Trump actually is the one who approved the Farm Bill in 2018. So we know he supports it. So is this one of these things where we've seen when Trump wants something, he sort of pushes and he gets a lot of it. Is this something he's going to bang some heads together and sort of go Hail Mary pass in the last minute? Who knows? Tom, what do you think?
I think I think that strategy may be the one that might be most clear to us, just because what we've seen recently, executive orders being the modus operandi for him getting things done when he can't gain that consensus, which I appreciate it because he wants to get certain things done. And so, and he certainly has come out and said in support many times, even after this was signed, he shortly thereafter came back and said, hey, well, we need to fix this. This is important. This is important industry for us. And so I do see there being some motivation there, and certainly him rallying his support base. Now, we can all agree there's been very little that gets done when it goes through traditional channels, just because there's so much party line by partisanship. So I think it, unfortunately, and this is what we're prepared for, is that it's going to go to the 11th hour. It's going to be a midnight session kind of thing, and they come out with something that I don't think anyone's going to be happy with, but I think it'll be a true compromise. I think what's interesting is, and I'd be really interested in Doug's take on this. I've read a lot more lately around almost like a three category system. One is the beverage category, which is starting to really kind of have a very I can see a framework coming together there. Then there's industrial hemp, which is already gaining comfort. Is that I think was the original intent of the 2018 Farm Act. And then there's like all other, which is going to capture anything frankly intoxicating or that isn't directly covered in the 2018 Farm Act. But a lot has to happen, and I think one of the interesting comments I did read, and I can't remember which senator or congresswoman said this, but they said, yeah, that's all good. We'll look at an extension, but you have to deal with the intoxicating, or else there's no deal. Like
Right.
today, you got to deal with it. And so that therein lies the rub, right? Because the calculation today, it deals with it in a really, really detrimental manner for the industry. So that is where I think folks have to come together with a compromise, or else there's no compromise, right?
Yeah. So what do you think about that, Doug?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of logic to those three buckets. And also, I just think as far as the positioning of the constituencies in Washington, you could see why that would make sense, right? You have a very powerful and well organized lobbying on the beverage front that would certainly like that setup very much, that controls the distribution of that. And I think also, just in people's and politicians' minds, there's something very different from a drink versus something you inhale. Whether it's logical or not, I think that's just how most people look at it. And I think there's something to it, because let's fast forward to a world 10, 15 years from now where all cannabinoids are legal. You got to wonder if the FDA will ever sanction any inhalable form of cannabinoids, right? They might not. We know the harms that have come with cigarettes. Are they going to say you can vape, but you can't smoke? It's a really tricky thing. So I think there's a lot of logic to that approach. And I think it also lines up with what people would want, right? And then what you do with the intoxicating cannabinoids is you put them in the same channel that, adult use or recreational marijuana is in now, which has already sort of been set up by the way they've done this rescheduling order. Because you're going to bifurcate medical and adult use. And then if you want to, if there's some good argument for using hemp to derive the cannabinoids instead of cannabis, which there probably is from an economic standpoint, let those be part of the state systems that are, Schedule 1 now, but probably my guess will be rescheduled.
Yes, but they need to get that middle part right, because I'm not going to go to a dispensary to buy dog treats.
That's exactly right.
That's like silly. So you mentioned earlier about Target. Now that brings up a very interesting topic that I've been thinking about from the payment card perspective. And Tom, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. So Target announces that they're going to bring hemp beverages. Now, Target traditionally they're a low risk merchant, right? Now they have these products. So doesn't that put them into the high risk category now?
The same thing. When Doug said that, I said, "Oh, this will be fun," because whoever their processor is, and I'm assuming it's one of the big, we'll call them, top 5, top 10 processors out there. They didn't underwrite that account, and they didn't, and we all know they beat up all their vendors. That's kind of the market. Those guys gave away the processing, and they're making a fraction of a basis point, and they're everything has to be right or else they're losing money. Well, this turns everything on its head, because now there's compliance. There's Brian, I don't even tell you, this is a good opportunity for you, Brian, by the way. The idea of them selling these products, and by the way, there's plenty of other retailers out there that have these products in their stores, and I can tell you stories about folks who are traditionally considered low risk that give us a call and say, hey, we just got dropped by our processor because somebody somewhere uses this product that has CBD in it, or has, and they may have literally no THC, no Delta 9 THC in that, and their processors, people who know what's actually in that product. They don't care. They just see the letter CBD and they go kill it. And so that is an interesting data point. And I would say to you, that does say something to me, that there's maybe something happening in the back rooms of Washington, D.C. to get them comfortable enough to make that move. I've also seen on the flip side, and I'd be very interested in your guys' thoughts on this, in the hemp seed world. So seeds, and we're going into a planting season, and so we can certainly see our activities increase, but even more so than last year. So we're seeing more let's say our seed merchants having much more volume, doing much more business than they have previously, and we can see the data and say, okay, yeah, there's an actual uptick. So you say to yourself, okay, are they getting the product in the ground so they can get it out of the ground and manufacture before this hits? Well, the math doesn't really work because that's happening for them to be able to process it, get it through, everything. But we're seeing that. So there's some level of confidence for them to do this. I mean, that's a real infrastructure expense they had to make to get this going. So we're not seeing folks pulling back. And this is in the supply chain. So it's one thing on the direct to consumer. Yes, they can go, hey, buy 3 bottles, we'll give you one for free, stock up, before November 12th, whatever marketing they use. I can see that too. And we're seeing a little of that. But what we're really seeing is like there's a lot of the infrastructure of the industry still going about it as business as usual. So that's another data point, whether or not, you can really quantify that anymore or qualify that any more than I just did. It's an interesting one. And so I would say to you, if those things are happening, there's some optimism. But again, we're kind of flying clouds. We can't see where we're going to land just yet. We hope that the guidance is good enough that we can get there. That's where I definitely feel like, okay, don't go putting the chairs on the tent yet. But what does that look like?
These are interesting data points. And by the way, for our audience, and that question I asked Tom about sort of the payment processing space is a lot of people don't realize that what a high risk merchant is, right? So they consumers think, oh, well, they're selling products and they just get a credit card account. Okay. No, the fact of the matter is if you're in a high risk product category, there's a significant amount of things that have to be done in underwriting and risk management because of the Bank Secrecy Act, right? So because of the Bank Secrecy Act, that brings anti-money laundering requirements. It brings KYC, know your customer, KYB, know your business. And that's why Qredible's in business, is to help companies like Tom's and others to reduce that burden, get it all done, make sure you're checking all those boxes, but using technology to do it. So, real life scenario. I had a bank that doesn't do high risk, and they were doing business with a very, very large retail conglomerate that sells hair care products and beauty supplies. And all of a sudden, the hemp stuff, hemp shampoo, hemp conditioner comes in. Well, the bank was going to shut them down because they realized that we're in the high risk business now, and we're not configured for high risk. So I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out, because any of these companies, even a deli that's now selling these things, are now in the high risk category, right? So you got to realize that there's that bleed over that changes the requirements. But I also want to address something that's a bit forward looking and a provocative, and it might just be because I'm confused. So the DEA has been moving towards rescheduling marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. I mean, that's happening, right? Now, when that happens and that's finalized, to me, I'm looking at it, and there's an interesting implication for synthetic cannabinoids like Delta-8, HHC, all those things that we said are going to be out the window. So those things are going to essentially fall into a Schedule 1, right? Because they're illegal once 781 passes. But if marijuana moves to Schedule 3, don't those things also fall under Schedule 3? And maybe it's just I'm confused, but Doug, am I wrong in thinking about that, or is there going to be a new schedule?
I don't think you are. So so for the audience, we'll back up on maybe the rescheduling for a second, because it was done in a sort of unexpected manner, at least to most observers, right? In that, the rescheduling order came out a couple of weeks ago, and it drew a line, and it said, if you are either FDA approved, which is basically nothing at this point, or you operate under a state medical license, you are immediately, as of right now, this moment, Schedule 3. And by the way, you got to register with the DEA. And by the way, the DEA is your new wholesaler. And then it said, yeah, which is a whole other, there's hours we could do on that. And then they said, if you're on the adult use side, we're proposing to reschedule it, and we're going to start administrative hearings at the end of June. So that's what it sets up. And I agree with you, right? Let's assume that those hearings result in adult use being pushed into Schedule 3 as well, then I would agree with you that all these cannabinoids derived from hemp should also, in theory, end up under that as well, right? And so now what's the market for them in the regulated cannabis space? Is there a market for them in there, or were they just existing because they were a substitute for people having to get medical cards, because they were lower priced, because there was easier access in convenience stores and gas stations and smoke shops than there was in licensed dispensaries? And I think the answer is probably a combination. I think, for businesses that want to grow low-cost biomass, and you also think about the interstate opportunities that could open up, or the international export opportunities that could open up, you could see a real market there. But for the products that, the average cannabis consumer is using, I'm not sure. But no, I'm thinking about it the same way as you. That was a long way of saying I agree with you.
Okay. So in this case, the Fitz logic actually is somewhat, it works, right?
Yeah.
So, and I do think that, I want to give our audience a genuine reason for optimism in the midst of all this. Is, first of all, I don't think it is the intention of the government to kill full spectrum CBD. And it's also not the intention to kill CBG, CBN, CBC. Remember, there's 125 different cannabinoids, right? And all of these have some benefits. So CBG, CBN, and CBC are distinct naturally occurring cannabinoids. They are not THC isomers. They're not synthetically converted, and they're not on the HHS similar effects to THC list, right? As they would call it, similar effects. So Section 781's categorizes and excludes the exclusion of those other synthetics doesn't apply to these other cannabinoids. So I do believe that I think they're going to get their stuff together. I think there's going to be some delay. Like you guys said, it's sort of a non-talking point to some of these politicians to say, let's keep these synthetic cannabinoids. So I think we're going to see some changing up on products. We're going to see new products being formulated. It's already happening. And by the way, we're seeing other products come in that are non-hemp related into these product catalogs. I mean, remember, we're monitoring thousands of merchants with these product catalogs. And what have I seen? I've seen a 550% increase in mushroom products hitting CBD hemp catalogs. Okay. Which means companies like Tom's and others, they have to pivot and make sure they have a policy for handling those products, which they do. They are able to do it quickly. We're seeing kava products, now being advertised all over the place and starting to hit. So I think some of these online companies are really in the midst of changing their product categories, which has implications, by the way, to the payment card processing space. You need to be able to pivot quickly and handle that. Companies like WestTown, are, looking at those advances as well and how they handle those things. But the banks and the card processors have to be prepared for product shifts, and shifts in product catalog, because it's not just going to be CBD and hemp, but we're also going to be seeing some more of this. And we're starting to see like CBN, sleepy time products come up with melatonin and a very low degree of THC. That's a great combination for sleepy time products, right? That could be compliant. But I also do believe, from an optimism standpoint, I agree with Tom that they're going to have to figure something out on this full spectrum. When the government is saying, hey, we're going to let Medicaid sort of support these products, well, they have a product that is meaningless right now. I mean, they have a full spectrum product that's not going to do anything for anybody. So you might as well forget about it. So you got to fix that problem. So I share that optimism that there's going to have to be something that happens. It can't happen in executive order because this is already law. So executive order, as far as I know, Doug, executive order can't can't wipe out a bill, right? That...
Well, ask this administration. You might get different answers. I mean, yeah, that's what I learned from Schoolhouse Rock. But
all right, well, me too. All right, so maybe it can. I don't know, but I was just going.
You know what the executive order can do, and I'd be curious, Tom, from your perspective, what the executive order can do is direct enforcement, right? Because ultimately, it's the executive branch that enforces these laws, and we saw the state legal marijuana industry prosper, grow, expand under executive enforcement guidance, right? And so if I'm curious, where does that leave a payment processor if it's illegal, but Trump comes out and says, I'm issuing this executive order, the Department of Justice cannot, and the FDA cannot devote any resources to the prosecution of these things. Now, where does that leave us now, right?
And maybe
they issue guidance. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, like we're in the middle of it, right? You just saw a couple weeks ago, a couple months ago, signs an executive order, changing, and this is very important, medical marijuana from a Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Okay, game on. My phone rang up. If I had $1 for everyone who said, hey, we get processed for dispensaries now, I wouldn't even care about November 12th, frankly. But it's not cut and dry. Even though, it's Schedule 3, medical marijuana. Now what, right? And so, but what it is doing, and this is the most, I think, the best part. And of course, okay, and then what's happened recently, and then I just read something about the DOJ leaning in on Schedule 3. So recognizing medical marijuana is a Schedule 3 drug now and not Schedule 1. Okay. So these are all positive, but there's steps, because the reality is, and this is someone, I get this question a lot, like, you guys already banked the marijuana space. Yes, we do. And we banked the hemp space. And so, but we never looked at it as recreational use versus medical, right? It was all marijuana, and we had a certain set of rules, and now we have to think about that too. But the big question is going to be, and for this conversation, I'll back it down a second. But for the industry, and by the way, the hemp industry and the marijuana industry, not just because the plants are cousins, but because the operators, they do it through, they'll have separation of church and state. But there's a lot of operators have a marijuana operation, and they have a hemp or marijuana brand and a hemp brand. Okay. And so, but it's not clear there either. But I do believe what it's doing is creating conversations, right? So there are folks who are looking at this and having to figure it out. The banks, the card brands, who are very important, and the federal government. So the federal government says, hey, this is Schedule 3 now. All right, got it. But what is the difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana? Same product, right? And so now you have a lot of, that going on. You have some tax implication. And so I think it's definitely going to be something that's going to gain a lot more momentum, attention. There's going to be some interesting movements this summer, I'm certain of it, around that industry. Now, going back to what you're just saying, and THCO, all that stuff, I see that also having potentially a home inside of what's coming about with Schedule 3. And that actually might placate some of the concerns. Well, okay, we'll deal with it there, and it's not gonna be in the gas station, right? That's the big concern. It's in the gas stations now, and the kids can buy it, and that's that's certainly the party line for why they need to regulate this. Okay, got it. But then I also wonder, where does it end, right? Does it now go to, and I'll play devil's advocate here. What if it's another product that's synthetic, that with 7-OH, right? That was very highly controversial. What if that somehow or another finds itself in this, Schedule 3? Well, that's a problem. There's some tremendous health risks there. And so now all of a sudden you go, okay, we got an opportunity, throw that into the mix, and now everyone throws their hands up and says, no way, we can't support this anymore. So it's fragile, and
Yes.
it, you know, and I don't want to keep, you know, punting, but there is so much movement happening. And I love, Doug, I love your point about like, hey, look, why don't we get to have the cannabinoid conversation, not these individual products, because and let's have the marijuana conversation, not recreational use versus medical. These are all constructs. Like the end of these, it's the same product that we're talking about here. And so I don't know if we're ever going to get there. It's certainly not in this cycle, in this timeline, but and not in this discussion. But I do think that there are some things that are being created that allow for some of these controversial topics to be slotted in fairly quickly and easily versus where we're at today. And I do think the rescheduling that's occurring, the clarification medical versus recreational it's not by accident. And so pay attention to that. But it is, you know, you take like muddy water and you run through it to make it a little muddier. I think that's where we're at with what's going on there.
Well, that's it's going to be an interesting wait and see. And you know, the one thing from a banking and payments perspective, I always like to say that in the high risk industries or the highly regulated industries, the risk isn't just about the company and the people who run the company. That's one aspect of it. The big risk comes in as to what they're selling and what they're saying about what they're selling. Okay. That's what makes, you know, companies like WestTown and others that serve this space, why they've become specialized in this, and why companies like Qredible and the technology we provide, we're constantly innovating on that, because we have to understand quickly in underwriting, what are they selling? You know, what are they saying about what they're selling? And, you know, once they get approved, did they change what they're selling? So those naughty products that they're not supposed to be selling all of a sudden appear in the product catalog 3 days after approval. Okay, you're not gonna be able to detect that without technology and realizing what's going on. So this is an interesting time, but it's a critical time, quite frankly, for technology. It's a critical time, and why I'm saying to payment processors, if you're in this space, you know, don't just automatically bail. If you're banking that, know what is going on. Use the technology to see what these product catalogs look like, how they're changing, and help your customers determine how they can be compliant, and, you know, without having to bail. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because listen, the payments industry is the core, is the lifeblood to commerce, right? I mean, it's the bottom line. If you can't use your phone to pay something for something off your credit card, your digital wallet, nothing's getting sold. So, you know, that's why I'm a big believer in this payment space, because it enables commerce, and the technology enables safe, compliant commerce. So we're going to wait and see what's going on. And Tom, before we sign off, first of all, thank you for joining us. I know you had an obligation, and sitting in your car to do this for us was really it meant a lot to me and to our audience. So thank you so much. And for those that are sort of in these murky waters in space and need a good partner for processing these types of payments, how can people learn more about WestTown Payments?
Absolutely. So if you're on LinkedIn, I'm very active on LinkedIn, certainly easy to access. And Brian once mentioned, yeah, there are very few Tom Lineens in this world. I actually know of two others. Different story for a different podcast, but otherwise I'm fairly easy to find there, or just sales@westtownpayments.com gets to me, gets to my team. We're always happy to help and educate, as we know it's an incredibly confusing time. We think we are on solid ground with where we are. Certainly with Qredible's help, we know where we stand today and where we're going to stand on November 13th. So that being the case, we can sleep at night. But I definitely am happy, and our team's happy to do more of these kind of conversations, but also one-on-one. That's the best way probably to reach me.
Absolutely. And Tom makes himself available for his clients. I know that for sure. And so, Doug, how can people learn about what you're doing, what you're working on, and how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I'll just do a quick VapeSAFER plug. So we're a nonprofit organization advocating for a robust and safe vape market, really, which, everything today we talked about was nuanced. Let's add a level of nuance from what makes a vape safer than other vapes and safer than combustion. And we do that across the hemp and cannabis spaces. And so if you're in that market, whether you're a consumer or a producer of hardware or terpenes, or you're a retailer, we'd love to get you involved in what we're doing. You can read a lot of the policy papers we've written all at vapesafer.org. And if you're interested in vape hardware that meets those standards, active710.com.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining Faith and I today in another Qredible Live episode. And this was a special edition. We're going to continue to monitor 781. And you guys are regular contributors to this. So, and good thought leaders for this industry. So I sincerely thank both of you for joining us today. And also, for if you'd like to learn more about Qredible, you could reach us at Qredible, Qredible.com, or look us up on LinkedIn and follow us. We work in a number of different industries. This one is an important one, obviously, but there's many other product industries, including tobacco and vape, non-CBD and hemp, that we support. And I know that's an area for WestTown as well. So anyway, if you'd like to learn more about us, you could reach us at Qredible.com. So that concludes today's episode. Thank you for joining us, to our faithful audience. And thank you, Faith, for your wonderful help as our producer always. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
All right.